Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Martin Reeves and Bob Goodson, both of whom co-authored this book right here, Like the Button That Changed the World. And I should say Martin, who is a repeat guest, he's been back, he's on the show before a couple of years ago. I think it was like 4 years ago. You're one of the earliest guests I had on the show, is the head of BCG's Henderson Institute, and also will be joining Berkeley this year. And Bob Goodson, who is the president and founder of Quid, and also was employee number one at Yelp way back in the day. Welcome, Martin and Bob.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for having us.
So look, this book is about, I think, what Fast Company called the most successful piece of code ever shipped. Now, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but I think it's, in one sense, this is a micro history. It's a history of a little piece of code, right, which has had a huge impact. But it's also a rumination on the nature of innovation, right? And how we sometimes get innovation wrong, because we have a tendency to think that, there is this heroic inventor, right, who comes up with this wonderful idea, and we give him or her credit for it, and we award him or her like a Nobel Prize. And you point out that it's actually not quite so simple, that it's really something which is distributed and maybe a little bit, chaotic and unplanned, right? And so I guess the first question is, whose idea was it to write this book? And Martin, how did you track down Bob, right, and tell this story?
The book really is like multi-layered serendipity, because my meeting with Bob was as serendipitous as our story of the like button. So Bob and I were getting to know each other, and we met for coffee to decide to get to know each other a little better. And Bob was moving at the time, and I knew that Bob collected documents, like he doesn't lose or anything. And
so you were thinking for your museum, for your collection?
Well, I sort of, just to make conversation, I said to Bob, you're moving, you must be finding interesting stuff in your millions of boxes. And he pulls out a sketchbook with a dated sketch of the like button, and I immediately thought, I can put that in my museum, my gallery of inventions. And then I saw the date on the sketch, and the date was May 2005. And I thought, hang on, I thought that Facebook invented the like button in 2009. So I said to Bob, are you telling me you invented the like button? And he gave me such a strange response. He said, no, well, maybe, I'm not sure. And I thought, well, how can you be not sure you invented, one of the most prevalent digital features on the planet? And so the 30 minutes turned into a 12-hour conversation, at the end of which we had the outline for a book, and we were really hooked on the story. So serendipity is the answer to your question.
Yeah, and Bob, maybe dig into that, because, was this the first time that you actually recognized your role in the creation of this?
In a way, yes. It's something that the day we did it, the day at Yelp in particular, where we put 3 emotional options on a piece of web content: useful, funny, cool. And we became the first to put multiple emotions on a piece of web content to react to it. And we were also the first on that day to allow you to react to a piece of web content with one click, which kept you on the page without forcing a page refresh or taking you to another page where you would add a comment or something like that. So we did those things not because we were trying to put something important down in the history of software, completely like the opposite of that. We were just trying to solve that day's design problem, which is, how do we make it even easier for people to send compliments when someone writes a Yelp review? And that's all we were thinking about. And the whole thing took a day to research, design, and code and release, with like between 2 and 4 people working on it. So, you move on, that's solved. Okay, it's working. You move on. And I kind of watched this thing develop and spread just because I'm interested in interfaces. But I'd never done the research to see if we were the first to do that. Well, the fact I just said, it wasn't clear to me without doing the research that someone hadn't done it 6 months earlier. So until Martin pushed us on it and we actually went and did the research, you're not really sure. So, I mean, imagine all the people out there that have made contributions to this feature and that aren't even aware of it, let alone every other thing that you hold, every piece of technology in your hand, however you're listening to this right now. There are hundreds of thousands of individuals who innovated on the margins to result in the technology with which you're listening to this podcast.
Yeah, and this story of serendipity rippled throughout the book. So we got a little bit too hooked on the story. So what was planned to be a year of research turned into 3 years. And the strangest thing about all of the pioneers of the like button, and we spoke to about 30 companies, was that none of them saw any special significance in the day that they made their contribution. They were just addressing that day's tactical challenge, might be voting or, content stream prioritization or something. And it was only later that the like button turned out to be a thing. I call it the moment when a thing becomes a thing, and then it becomes a big thing. But it was absolutely not a grand design. So I thought, wow, this is the perfect story of what I'd long suspected about innovation, which is it's neither as planned as the hero stories we tell about it, nor as manageable as the managerial structures and metrics and plans and goals that we put in place to manage it.
Now, I was trained as an economic historian, and of course, in economic history, we have there's two different schools. I mean, to simplify, there's the great man school, of Thomas Carlyle, right? And then there's kind of the longue durée story of Fernand Braudel. And I was really, schooled in the latter. And so, it was heartening for me to see that, there were all of these different parallel developments. And so presumably if Bob, you didn't exist, the like button would have emerged regardless, right? But,
Exactly.
but I think it also, I mean, there's something special about Silicon Valley. I think this is sort of the third story that's being told, because while everything you say about innovation is true, it seems like Silicon Valley, it's even more true, right? Because of the interconnectedness of it, right? So when Leibniz and Newton were both inventing the calculus, I mean, they weren't talking to each other and they weren't corresponding, but it's almost impossible for anything to happen in Silicon Valley, without knowledge of it spreading almost instantly, right? So first of all, maybe talk a bit about Silicon Valley's uniqueness, and perhaps even, Bob, how the heck did you wind up in Silicon Valley as a medieval historian?
Well, yes, it's true that when I was recruited to come to San Francisco, I was at Oxford studying medieval history, and I met one of the co-founders of PayPal, Max Levchin, at Oxford. He'd come to give a talk, and I was studying the print press at that time and the effects of the print press on education in particular, and the fact that literacy rates were less than 5% in Europe on the eve of the invention of the print press. And as soon as you could make text readily available and cheaply available, literacy rates shot up, and it transformed society and democracy and education. This one simple innovation. And I was just thinking about that week, and then went to this talk and watched the co-founders of eBay and Google and PayPal on stage at Oxford talking about what they were building and the sheer scale of who it was reaching. This is in 2003. And it just dawned on me that this new wave of technology was as important, if not more important, than the print press. And it really was that simple. I just sat in the lecture theatre thinking, the new print press is here, and I would like to spend the rest of my life contributing to it. And so that's what led me to sort of change course and join Max Levchin. And as Martin interviewed me for the book, he kind of drew this out of me through the book. It's kind of curious that someone like that would even take a shot with someone like myself or with that background. But it was a different time. It was the early 2000s. It was actually hard to recruit people to come into things that were unproven and experimental, because so much had just failed, right? We had the crash of Web 1.0, where it was just like a wasteland of broken dreams, basically. And so if you had a job, you would not leave it. If you were already eBay earning six figures, why would you leave that to take a chance on something new, right, which had seemingly little chance of working? So first of all, it wasn't easy to recruit people into those positions. You kind of needed to take people who perhaps to some extent didn't have anything to lose. And but Max was also very aware of the potential of throwing together lots of different thinkers into one space. So he brought together about 5 to 10 of us in this new incubator model that he created, and the backgrounds were so varied. I mean, there was a Russian physicist, there was a Scottish technologist, there was some of the PayPal people. There was just like a real mix of people. And I think back then there was an understanding that if you're going to do new things, you probably need new perspectives. And so Silicon Valley was a I mean, it always has been a special place, and that just happened to be the culture that was around at the time.
Yeah, Martin, I mean, your background is also a little different. I mean, a lot of people think Silicon Valley is just full of coders, right, and engineers, but there are these diverse perspectives. And do you think that history, historians have maybe an advantage when it comes to recognizing innovation? I think I remember one time Wall Street Journal had this big conference, and they asked all the people there, like, what is the most important thing for you to understand if you want to understand innovation? And the number one answer was history. Right? I think this caught everybody off guard.
Yeah, well, I'd done some, in a sense, I was primed for the conversation with Bob, but I didn't anticipate the conversation with Bob, because I'd done work on the mathematical signature of serendipity at the London Institute of Mathematical Sciences. So essentially, if you regard innovation as the recombination of existing elements of knowledge, there's rarely complete de novo knowledge, but there are frequently recombinations of the knowledge that we have. And you look at the mathematics of that recombinatorial process, it's highly unpredictable. It's very counterintuitive because it involves a double power law, which humans have no intuition for. But it's not random. It's a specific mathematical signature, and if you look at the detailed accounts of technologies, I mean, even the apparently clear-cut ones have always had the forgotten heroes. So, look, a relatively clear-cut one I was taught at school was the Sir Humphrey Davy and the miner safety lamp. The Industrial Revolution was almost brought to a halt because of interruption of coal supplies, because of methane explosions killing, thousands or hundreds of miners in the north of England. And Sir Humphrey Davy, this brilliant chemist of the Royal Institution, received a very clear-cut definition of the problem, and within a week had solved it, and he'd built his safety lamp, and it saved the Industrial Revolution. And his invention had exactly the impact intended. Well, not really. So I actually went back to this one. I thought, let me sort of be devil's advocate. Let me entertain the fact that in some cases innovation is highly planned and foreseeable. Well, Stevenson was working on a safety lamp at the same time. Somebody called Clancy was working on a safety lamp. They wrote vitriolic letters to each other. Davy, who was an avid journaler, suspiciously has a complete, blank in his journal in terms of what he was doing before he came up with the miner safety lamp. The invention was disputed. It's rumored that I had the pleasure of doing a demonstration at the Royal Institution using an original Sir Humphrey Davy safety lamp.
I was there, by the way, for this demonstration that Martin's about to describe. I was in the audience for this.
And I was primed to the fact that, like, demonstrations is like working with animals and children. Like, they often don't work as planned. And it didn't work. And the archivist who looks after all of these scientific artifacts basically said, well, they often don't work. And it's rumored that the original lamp didn't really work very well because it was easily penetrated by a draft. And she told me that Faraday's electric motor, is rumored never to have worked. And it's rumored that Galileo, for instance, had a telescope that the optics was so bad that he probably couldn't have seen what he reported seeing. So I think,
Hang on, let me just explain, since I was in the audience, that Martin was doing a demonstration of the safety lamp. And at the moment he ignited it, it didn't work, and it set off this huge, basically fireball on this London stage, like shocking the audience and making us wonder how Martin avoided setting fire to himself. So it was very fun. It was a great start to the lecture, and and quite a moment. And there you go. The safety lamp didn't always work. Proven on stage by Martin in like 2024.
But it's not, the serious side to this is it's not just the stories that are, falsely simple, but there are real consequences, because if you organize your innovation processes with, metrics, plans, stage gates, norms, and you're expecting this highly planned, manageable journey, and instead you get sociality and serendipity, maybe you're not going to innovate as effectively as if you were more modest in the first place.
Well, look, you talk about Brian Arthur's theory of innovation, and, it's built on this notion of modularity to some degree, right? And I spent a lot of time talking about modularity in my classes, and it seems like software is uniquely suited for this type of modular architecture and innovation, right? So while cars have components and subcomponents, right, and jet engines have these components and subcomponents, and the innovation that happens has these positive feedback loops. There's something about software which makes it really easy to break it down into these modules and these routines and subroutines, which allow for almost continuous reassembly, right? And so does that mean that this theory of innovation is even more relevant today than ever before?
Well, I'll let Bob comment on the software, but if we take innovation as being serendipitous, in other words, we hope for A and we get B, and it's a process of recombination, and we don't know the power of the combinations. We'll try 1,000 things, and one of them will be successful, and successful in a way that we didn't anticipate. How would you multiply serendipity? I think it's clear what you do in principle, and I think there are a few companies that do this intentionally. You'd reduce the cost of the collisions. So in other words, you'd have a lot of recombination events. You'd make them cheap. You'd have people that are very observation-oriented and open-minded, probably cognitively diverse, so that when you're expecting A but you get B, you actually see it, because sometimes our expectations are so strong they blind us to what actually happened. And you would do it on a continuous basis. And also you'd have many modules that could recombine in many ways. So, that sounds like software to me. But what do you think, Bob?
I think the one thing I'd add about specific to software and your comment, Greg, is that it's particularly true when there's an interface involved. So for consumer software, the interface is so important as the vehicle to the functionality, right? The mechanism to functionality. So, and it's completely visible. So when I spent many years doing user interface design, you're constantly looking at everything else in the space. And you just wake up in the morning and you'll hit like 3 or 4 other sites and see how do they look today, because they're always evolving. And then if there's a feature that you like the look of, then and you think it might be working, then you just take the feature, and there's very little protection over that in the way that there are for some like back end systems, right? Like if a company has a unique database structure that's allowing it to be more efficient, then it might take a while for someone else to learn that. Of course, people move around a lot in Silicon Valley, so there is a lot of transfer of knowledge. Even at my company, at Quid, we would make, it was funny, such funny timing. It always used to happen this way. We'd make some sort of technical breakthrough, and we know we're really on to the next phase, right? Because we were analyzing the world's text since 2010. So there were various stages in that development where we were really on the cutting edge of what is now like becoming a huge industry. And every time we made significant breakthroughs, we found Google would poach one of our most senior engineers. And it was just uncanny. It was like, boom, like one of the top engineers who worked on the feature just disappears to Google. So the strong companies from an engineering standpoint, they know where the breakthroughs are happening and they know how to find the talent, and they will just bring them in by paying them twice as much as everyone else. And so there is this like transportation of labor where once they're there, what is the protection of, sharing what you learned, right? There is no protection. And that's deliberately designed into the American system and into Silicon Valley. It's highly protected. That transfer of labor and knowledge is highly protected in labor law in a way that it isn't quite as well protected in other countries, actually. So a lot of the success of Silicon Valley is really thoughtfully baked into the legal system and into the American processes.
So, Bob, in terms of like poaching people, in a way, that's a serendipitous perspective, because it's a recognition of the sociality of innovation. Because often companies believe that we invented that thing, we're going to dominate that thing, we're in the lead, and they just don't sort of think, oh, there's a whole community of people facing the same situations. There's a community of innovation, and I need to be part of it. So in a way, that's the serendipitous healthiness of Silicon Valley, I think.
But wasn't that sort of an unintended consequence? I mean, when the labor laws were written in California, it wasn't, hey, let's create Silicon Valley, right?
I mean, some of it seems to have been tuned for it, actually, at least speaking to lawyers that, as I've worked with various lawyers in Silicon Valley, you know, around labor, you know, where you can't help it when you hire hundreds of people, you end up kind of understanding the nuances of the contracts, and you end up asking a lot. I've asked a lot of questions of lawyers of like, is that legal? You know, like some of the company has done that to us. And the lawyers have always been, you know, pretty clear that it's designed that way in terms of like the mobility of labor, for example, to foster innovation. At least that's their perspective.
Well, I think the labor laws go all the way back to the 19th century. So in California, and I think it was, I forget exactly what the motivation was, but I think there were some folks that really wanted to, you know, recruit, so they lobbied for it. But it's not just through the circulation of employees in Silicon Valley. There are these meetups. I think you described a couple of them in the book, where people they just want to share, you know, and it's very different from other parts of the world where people kind of hold things close to the chest and they try not to tell everybody else what they're up to. I mean, it seems like even before this stuff makes it onto the website, there's going to be people talking about what they're doing.
Certainly that was true in the early 2000s. I mean, it was a complete melting pot. You know, people need to remember as well that it wasn't clear that there was so much financial potential in what people were working on. I mean, when in 2004, the vision for any entrepreneur, like the absolute gold standard, was to create $1 billion company. And those were so rare in 2004 that you could create $1 billion internet company that it seemed like a distant dream. Even doing that seemed like a distant dream. And you fast forward just 20 years. I mean, first of all, there are $1 trillion startups that were built in that era. $1 trillion companies. I swear, like having worked with people like Max Levchin and spent time with, you know, Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman and others, right? People that were really in the thick of it and have been behind some of the most epic companies in the last 20 years. I did not want in one occasion hear the phrase $1 trillion company. Like not once. Like the idea for even the most visionary people that companies would be that large was not on the table. And so, you know, there just wasn't as much money in the system in this work. And I think that, you know, there was a lot of idealism as well. There was a lot of motivation for people working in the early 2000s on the web that for the impact it would have on education and it would have on democracy in a positive way, right? That it would be liberating. At the time, again, we put so much emphasis on social media now that we easily forget that before it was possible for citizens to share information. The only way to get information out there was through these, you know, usually individually owned massive media companies. So that there was a lot of dissatisfaction about censorship and about, you know, media being controlled by only the wealthy and so on. So there was a lot of idealism involved, and I worked with a number of people back then who didn't care about the money at all. They were only working for social change and social good. And so I give that backdrop because the amount of sharing that took place, I think was all part of that spirit. You know, there wasn't, I think that now, as I look at how the processes are, there are, you know, sharing, people are more cautious because they know the kind of scale that's possible and the risks involved with sharing. But back then it wasn't considered an issue at all.
Yeah, I think this is quite an ancient practice in a way. So we're seeing a modern instantiation of it with technology. But going back to the Royal Institution in London, created in the late 1700s, why? Because Britain was paranoid about losing the technology race to Germany and to France. And what was the idea? The idea was their charter says to promote and foster science. What did that mean in practice? It meant inviting celebrities like Humphrey Davy and Faraday to invent new things and to be celebrated for doing so by giving public lectures where essentially they gave away the IP to everybody. It was a sort of like a recognition for diffusion swap. So essentially what Britain got out of it is lots of people being celebrated for sharing their inventions rather than keeping them proprietary, which did indeed foster innovation. So it's a sort of an old version of the same phenomenon.
Well, maybe we can go back to those early days at Yelp, because the motivation behind these, the different buttons was to promote user-generated content. And, this is at the early days of, I guess, what was called Internet 2.0, right? And before that, it was mostly information being pushed out, right, by people who had published websites. And of course, now most of the content on the internet from YouTube and Facebook and everywhere else is generated by users, many of whom are not being compensated in any way for the production of this content, providing reviews and so forth. And so maybe just go back in those days and, kind of remind us what it was like to have a world where, it was unclear whether people would be, willing to write reviews of restaurants and barbershops and laundries and so forth.
Yeah, I guess it seems obvious now that people will do that, but it wasn't obvious. And one of the reasons is that only 1% of people using the internet in the early 2000s, even by 2003 or 2004, were adding any content at all. It was really like a readership format. You would go online and read content, but there were only 1% of people contributed. It was sort of a big deal to contribute to the web.
But it was very frictionful too. If you wanted to create a blog, for instance, you had to, set this thing up, get a URL and all that.
Yeah, exactly. You might create a WordPress blog, for example, in 2004. That was a popular, and it still is around, but it was a popular way to write a blog. But there was long form content. It's like writing, every time you posted, you had to write an essay, and it all felt very formal. And yeah, there was some work involved in setting up your website. And I was a contributor to Wikipedia in the very early days. And even that was quite a lot of work. You had to build a reputation. You had to submit articles and then wait for people to come and, moderate them. And then if you didn't log in, you wouldn't even see the moderations they made or their comments. So it was a lot of work. And also the connection to the internet was just slower. So everything you tried to do in terms of posting content took longer. Even if you're only waiting 10 seconds or 15 seconds to post something, there's still a lot of friction in the system. So when Yelp was being created, it wasn't obvious at all that you could get large numbers of people to contribute content, because normal people who had the opinions needed to rate restaurants and bars and doctors and so on weren't really adding content to the internet. So it was part of that wave where everyone was trying to figure out, separately and for different business reasons, how do we get people to contribute content, which is why in some ways it was that the movement of user generated content. And nowadays we don't think twice about it. And the like button really, something Martin and I cover in the book, is that the like button really greased the wheels for that process, because it is the simplest way to contribute content to the internet. And it still is. With one click, people don't think that they're contributing content. They just think of it as something else. Like it's a type of reading almost. I'm giving my reaction, but it is contributing content. You're putting your name on something and you're adding data to a complex system, which is why we call it the atomic unit of user-generated content.
But the like button was meant to reward the people who provided kind of more detailed content, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the like button was intended to incentivize people to write more reviews. It was that simple. In the first instance, it was simply that, Greg, you wrote 5 reviews, and if you come back to the website and you hear nothing for a week or two, you kind of think, did anyone care? Whereas if you get
empty room problem, right?
Right, exactly. Whereas if you get a message a day later saying, Greg, 10 people found your reviews useful and 3 found them funny and 2 said they were cool, then you're going to go, oh, nice. And you can see, see who they are. And then you're going to come back and write more reviews. And in the first case, that's all the we now call it the like button, but that's all these reaction buttons did. And yet as we trace through the book, that simple feature became adopted in so many more rich and nuanced ways and became integrated into social media. But that's how it began.
Yeah, there is something quite brilliant and impressive about the like button in a way. So through serendipity and our collective intelligence, we created the like button. But it's so elegant because you don't need a manual for this feature. It plugs right into thousands of years of linguistic and gestural history and our propensity for social learning, the fact that we like to recognize others and learn from them. And one of the ideas we were fascinated by, it came from Max Levchin, was the idea that it is actually the atomic unit of content, because you by expressing your preference for somebody or some piece of content and your homophily with that person, it's the simplest and most compact thing you can say that is actually meaningful to others. And so there really is something quite brilliant about the simplicity of this thing, just a dozen lines of JavaScript code and taking a gesture that was already well established in the culture and having that as the feedback feature that revolutionized the world of advertising and provided a monetization route for social media. So in a way, it goes to my motivation for writing the book, which is such a small thing with such a big impact, and we hardly remarked or noticed because it was using existing elements in the culture. That was the dimensions of that are truly fascinating to me.
Now, you went on a bit of a detour into kind of the semiotics of the thumbs up, right? So, I mean, you can have a like button without any thumbs involved, right? In fact, some of the like buttons are smiley faces, some of them are, hearts, and but the iconic thumbs up has that's sort of what people imagine when you say, "Hey, like button," because of Facebook, and I thought it interesting that the history of the thumbs up doesn't actually go back that far, right? As far as we know, right? It only goes back to, I guess it was Jerome who popularized it, right, in his painting.
Well, of course, humans are intrinsically obsessed by hands, our agency, and faces. This is what babies stare at most of the time, hands and faces. So hand gestures are, ancient. But the thumbs up gesture, it's a very interesting story. You referred to a painter, Jerome. So most Americans think that they know for a fact that it comes from the Roman Colosseum, the mercy shown to the gladiator or not with the thumbs up or the thumbs down. But actually, it's a distortion in this painting from the 1870s for dramatic effect. The true gesture in the Colosseum was probably more like the sheathed thumb and the downward pointing thumb. But nevertheless, like as Wittgenstein says, the language games are however we play the game. The fact is that this artifact is now celebrated as a fact. And so I'm quite interested in, why the designers reached for the thumb when they were looking for a symbol to hide the novelty and the technicality of what was going on behind the scenes. And it was quite natural for them to do so because it was implanted in American culture, and it received a little booster in precisely the year 2000 with the movie Gladiator 1, which Ridley Scott was allegedly planning to turn down because he didn't want to make what he called a sandals and toga movie, a sort of a cheesy Roman movie. But actually, he was shown the very same painting with this historic distortion of the thumbs up and the thumbs down, and he was impressed by the drama of the painting. And so the thumb received a little booster at the time that Bob drew it. And so we asked people, like, what was in your mind when you drew the thumbs up or used the thumbs up? And it's probably intuitive, but maybe I can ask Bob now. Were you?
Yeah, were you thinking of the Fonz? I mean, I would have thought of the Fonz as the inspiration.
Yeah, I must say I did grow up watching the Fonz, and I did love the gesture from the Fonz, which touches on another area where the thumbs up got the boost, which is James Dean. And why was James Dean using it, after the Second World War? It's because the fighter pilots in the Second World War needed a way to communicate. The planes were too loud, so they'd lean their arm out of the cockpit and, give a thumbs up, because they couldn't be heard. So this gesture was used a lot in, by the fighter pilots in the Second World War. And so that gesture came back, and just like the white T-shirt, right, the classic kind of American white T-shirt, which was actually underwear during the Second World War, and wristwatches and all these things that were just, suddenly became cool in the 50s because it was the people that went from America to the Second World War and came back with these things. And so that was another little boost in it. And then that went to James Dean. And then of course, like the Fonz is sort of like a slightly comic parody of James Dean, right? And so it's and so that, I think that era, the post Second World War era, the thumbs up became big. Something that Martin has said in a talk we gave last week in London, which I thought was very funny, is that Americans think of the thumbs up as the Roman gesture, and the Italians call the thumbs up the American gesture because they know it's like in Italy, this is really rude, right? Like they would never do that to say everything's okay.
It's like syphilis, right? It's always somebody else's disease, right?
So they point to each other. But the funny thing is we're trying to write a book about technology, and I think we actually wrote, I know we've written the most comprehensive guide to where the thumbs up symbol came from. Because Martin and I thought we can just read the book on that and it will be a couple paragraphs, right? Like we'll just go find the book where someone figured that out. And no one has, right? There's some brilliant observations in different segments of history, but no one had actually put that narrative together. So we have an entire chapter basically just tracing where the symbol came from.
Yeah, one of my favorite chapters is Why the Thumb.
Yeah.
An idea, which is, I think, a practical business idea, which we stumbled across in the same chapter, is this book that was very, very popular with designers around the year 2000 called Don't Make Me Think. And it was the idea that innovation is not about complexity, novelty, features, new functionality. It can be, but that probably won't spread. The more complex your story is, the less it's likely to spread. If at the other extreme, you can hijack a piece of evolutionary or anthropological history and just make it seem like it's not really an innovation, it's just a thumbs up gesture. By exaggerating the unremarkableness of the innovation, you probably have something that can spread enormously. And I think that's a very practical idea, because I think companies have choices about how they name innovations. They can draw attention to their novelty. They can exaggerate the novelty, exaggerate the analogy to things that already exist, and downplay the novelty. And these are really important choices when you have in digital innovation the possibility of things scaling very, very quickly. But they have to be absorbed very quickly to be able to do that.
And there was a little technical hiccup, right? So prior to, I guess around this time, you couldn't interact with a website without causing it to refresh, right? And so this was, I guess, JavaScript enabled you to do this right around this time. Is that right?
Yeah, the biggest implementation of JavaScript was Gmail, which for anyone that was around when Gmail came out, it looked like magic, because in any email before it, like Yahoo Mail or Hotmail, every time you sent a message or you interact, even to open a message, it forced a reload of the page, meaning for those younger listeners, a page refresh where the URL changes and it takes now what seems like maybe a second, right? Versus a website that you can sit on like Gmail and click and the email will open and you can like send a message and it all happens without forcing a refresh of the page. So Gmail was the first major use of JavaScript to enable that kind of interaction on the web. And the co-founder of Yelp, Russ Simmons, had been recently using Gmail, and he decided he would see if he could make a button work like that. And he thought he could because he'd seen more complex things done in Gmail. But when we interviewed him, he said, I didn't know for sure because I didn't know it would work, because he had to, you have to not just, when you click using JavaScript, if that's how the button's written, the back end still needs to collect the information that you, Greg, clicked on this review, and that now the count of number of likes in that review, like a table has to be updated. So it still had to pass some information to the back end server without refreshing the page. And, but Russ wrote those lines of code, which we actually have in the book. We have the original lines of code that the current CEO and co-founder of Yelp, Jeremy Stoppelman, kindly gave us. He looked back in the code log, and we have those 20 lines of code that we've published in the book. But Russ wrote those in an afternoon, and, he made it work.
Now, I think you said that Zuckerberg was reluctant to actually add a like button, and it took some convincing to get him to put this in. I mean, now, of course, it's Facebook's trademark. I mean, I think they still have the meta swirl at the sign, but I remember for years when I would take students to visit Facebook, they would always insist on posing in front of the thumb. I think it was probably, more popular than Alcatraz and the Golden Gate Bridge as a tourist destination. Buses would pull aside on the road, and you have to avoid getting hit by cars, and people would, get their pictures taken.
Yeah, I think it's a testament to flexibility and open-mindedness, because serendipity requires you to reframe when you get something you don't expect. So Zuckerberg, for seemingly good reasons, given what he knew about at the time, opposed for 2 years on multiple occasions the introduction of a like button. He eventually relented because the underground team had carried on. But interestingly, he took a bigger decision than he probably thought, because he bumped into the idea that, this solves for the age-old advertising joke that 50% of my advertising is wasted. You can just never know which 50%. Well, with this granular, low-cost, instantaneous, highly segmented feedback, you could know that this person liked this advertisement, this person likes this content. So not surprising that the social media companies are actually now the advertising companies, and many, many times bigger than the companies that still describe themselves as advertising agencies. It created one industry. This little button created one industry effectively, and overturned another, and introduced an entirely new and exotic digital ecosystem of different ways of advertising and communicating. Probably the most alien chapter to me was when I had to go walk on Mars by talking with 16-year-old TikTok stars and understand how the 16-year-old can have 50 million followers, $5 million of income for making three-minute videos dancing with a reptile on their shoulder. That was a fun piece of research to do. That was, that was another planet for me. But that was a consequence of this democratization of creation that came along with social media, and that wasn't entirely due to the like button, but it was greatly facilitated by the existence of the like button.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the business that is made possible by this, because, on the one hand, I mean, obviously, if you can craft a portrait of somebody's preferences, then you have a massive business. And I remember when Facebook was doing its IPO, I had a lot of press interviews and so forth about their business model. And it was clear to me that this was going to be huge. But the question is, what does the like button add that you can't simply get from, say, browsing behavior? So Netflix has gotten rid of its thumbs up, thumbs down, because they can tell what you like simply by observing your behavior, right? They don't need to ask you what you think of a movie. They can just sort of study how long you spend looking at the movie. So what do we learn from the like button we can't learn from just observing behavior?
I think the like button was revolutionary in that it created a feedback loop in terms of who liked what and who liked who, instantaneous and virtually cost-free, when that didn't exist. So we have to think back to the time. What existed? So this is like going back to the world of the page refresh. What was the feedback loop at the time? It was the Nielsen set-top box. And what could that tell you? That could tell you that the TV was tuned to channel 13 at a particular time. It couldn't tell you whether people were watching TV or whether they're in the kitchen making a cup of tea. And it couldn't tell you whether they loved or hated what they were watching. That was about as good as it got. And then we got this granular feedback. So that permitted all sorts of things, right? It permitted the prioritization of content streams, the suggestion of friends, the targeting of advertising, the high-speed prototyping and testing of advertising, the algorithmic segmentation, being more granular in your... So all of that became possible because of this thing. Is it the only way of doing it? No, but the staying power of the like button is remarkable because of that. If you talk to the analytic agencies, which we did, that now only specialize in analyzing the sort of the metadata of social media. They have many metrics of engagement, of purchase propensity, but the like button is still the atom of content, one of the simplest, the most powerful single pieces of content you can have. Now, where do things go next? I mean, that's the speculation of the final chapter, but we look at the likely life extension of the like button in a new guise, the like button at the bottom of your Chat GPT page. What is that doing there? What's that going to do? Whatever they do with that is going to be controversial, complex,
Right.
powerful. So I think we're set for a new chapter on the like button. But already the brain implant technologies of Elon Musk, there are working clinical applications of that. So maybe we don't have to rely on reports of what people like. Maybe there's ways of directly knowing. I saw a technology the other day that analyzed in real time the involuntary facial muscle movements that, again, tell us whether you like something or not whether you think you like something or you say you like something. So we, in the future, we could have these direct signals, and we did come across enterprises that have alternatives. They use watching time of videos, for example, as a metric of engagement, and not the like button, but still worldwide across all social media, and also a lot of other businesses too, entertainment, shopping, information, the thumbs up symbol and the local equivalent of the word like is dominant because it is so elegant, and it plugs right into our evolutionary psychology. It's not artificial in any way.
But I mean, there's some trade-off, right? So the simpler it is, perhaps the more likely it is that people will, utilize it. But there's something lost, right? Where it's just a simple yes or no binary choice.
There's something added.
Right?
There's something added and something lost. One of the things we were fascinated by was, maybe you know more about this, Bob. As communication technology evolves, often we extend the reach of communication, but we lose some emotional nuance. And you could say the like button is putting back some of that emotional nuance. And throughout communications history, there are many examples of that. Sure, there's ambiguity, but there's always ambiguity. One of the strangest things that Bob and I are finding on the road talking about the book is that usually in the audience there's a strict grammarian or an orthodox linguist that objects to the idea that when people say they're liking something, they may be doing things other than actually liking the content. And our reaction is, of course, the humans will play
Right.
all of the games with their linguistic symbols always. They'll dissemble, they'll lie, they'll charm. I mean, as with any other aspect of language.
Or like if somebody announces on their Facebook page that their parents just died or something, right? You want to make it clear that you have noticed and that you feel for them, but the like button doesn't seem to do it for you, right? And so, so there have been some, there's been an expansion of these different forms of expression, and now with emojis, right? We have almost an infinite palette of expressive detail. And so that seems to on one hand offer up a lot more granularity, but it also kind of, creates some frictions for people to express interest or engagement.
Yeah, I was curious that Bob's first sketch, May 2005, was of the thumbs up and thumbs down. But what his company Yelp actually did was the multifunctional emotion button, useful, funny, cool. And then we had the sort of the convergence onto the single dimensional symbol because of the Facebook's
and
worldwide rollout.
They got rid of thumbs down,
And they got rid of the thumbs down, so it became even simpler, and which was inevitable once we had an attention economy model. You wanted to maintain attention, not turn attention off. But then, as you say, recently we've seen a proliferation of multi-emotion buttons, which what do they do? In a sense, it's a bit like the invention of the question mark in in England because of the degeneracy of English grammar relative to Latin. You simply couldn't know whether somebody is asking a question or not unless you put something back into the conversation, a new symbol, because you couldn't hear the intonation of the person speaking. So we're putting all of these things basically in different ways, put back emotional content into otherwise digitally barren conversation.
Yeah. Well, okay. So maybe we can talk a bit about the unintended consequences of the button. And I don't think anybody anticipated the rise of the influencer economy, right? Which has exploded. And there's all these people that are, I guess, fishing for likes, right? Because likes can be translated into money, but also it can be translated into, I don't know, personal satisfaction and happiness and meaning. And of course, that gives rise to the possibility that you don't get any of these likes. And everyone says that this is at the heart of the, unhappiness that so many people are experiencing, particularly children. So, I mean, do you think net that the current usage of the like button is ultimately to the good? I mean, how do we deal with some of these negative consequences that people are talking about?
Well, I think we didn't want to judge the technology as being good or bad because I think other people are more expert at that. That's been done several times before. Also, it seems to us strange to take something so human, which is giving recognition for preference for content as a form of communication between humans. And we know that the brain science of liking and being liked offline is exactly, not similar to, but exactly the same as online liking and being liked. And so it's strange to say, well, that technology is bad because it's our humanity. It's so close to who we are. I think the difference is in volume, not quality. So liking may be neurologically identical to real world liking, but I could probably only meet 3 people in a day called Greg LeBlanc if I tried really, 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 really hard. But I could probably interact with hundreds of people online in my bedroom late at night. And if I'm at a very sensitive developmental age where I'm acutely aware of my popularity with friends, and I look at the like counters, then clearly there are the potential joy of being liked turns into depression if you're not liked or not relatively liked. Nobody saw that. And that's not surprising, actually, because nobody foresaw the biggest benefits of the technology. So how could we foresee the disbenefits? So the regulators bumbled their way through. And actually, I think that regulatory bumbling is a bit like tinkering in innovation. It's a feature, not a bug. But the difference is that I think there are 2 essential differences in the case of AI and social media. One of them is that they are close to human propensities, so they're likely to be disturbing. It's not like we're talking about an electric toaster or something. We're talking about how we communicate, how we recognize each other. So the effects are likely to be profound. And the other one is the speed of spread. So the conclusion we come to is that we do have to up our regulatory game. And it's mainly the speed of the adaptation mechanism. So we think that the regulatory bumbling is a great form of regulatory adaptation. It's not anticipatable, but there are a number of things we can do to speed up the process, the learning process. I think one of them is public observatories. So in order to learn, regulators need access to data. It can't all be locked up in proprietary data sets. And we've got good precedents for that with adverse event reporting in pharmaceuticals, for example. The regulators have to be educated. Are the regulators the most expert people in the society on AI? Not really, the exact opposite, but they need to be trained in the latest technologies. I think the big one, though, is adaptive regulation, which is the idea of regulation being a once and for all, complex piece of legislation that, science and seals the matter is not realistic. But something like the accident investigation protocols essentially say every time we learn something, we lock that granular learning into some sort of regulation. And if we come up with something better, we change it. And that is so powerful, right? The air transport has gone from being the least safe form of transport to the most safe form of transport. Now, these, you might say, are obvious thoughts, but they're not deployed in digital technologies today. And we better be ready for the next big one, AI. So we think there's a whole regulatory innovation agenda that we try to lay out in the one of the later chapters in the book, which is as important as the innovation agenda, the regulation, the innovatory regulation agenda.
I mean, you talk about a couple of options, right? Where, for instance, you can see how many people liked your post, but then you can't see how many people liked other people's posts. There's another option where, you can't see, I don't know who liked your post, but you can see how many. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways you can play with this, right? What have we learned from those different experiments?
Yeah, there are some of those changes that you mentioned. Social media sites have started to implement in recent years. They've started to modify what is and isn't visible to the user. And then, of course, we're seeing regulation come in Australia recently. I think it was in Texas last week, where some states in the US and some countries are seeking ways to limit the use of social media for young people. And as Martin said, there's such a sensitive developmental stage in adolescence where it's one of the most intense social stages of our development and a very sensitive stage of development. And so it might just be that, as people in their mid-40s, sort of posting on LinkedIn, you're probably not running into psychological harm in that sort of scenario. Whereas we can't assume that the same mechanism applied to different age groups would necessarily be the case. And I really like the example that Martin mentioned of the airline industry, where you have, the most dangerous form of transport in the world become the safest form of transport in the world, because of the regulations around, if there's ever an issue, we have to understand it deeply, right? There has to be an investigation. And if a part on the plane failed, the mentality of the industry is, let's never let that happen again. Now, one of the reasons that is harder to regulate in something like social media is, one, the explosive growth, right? The exponential growth and the fast moving nature of these sites. They don't stay still. They're always adjusting, always developing. I mean, social media before TikTok came out looked completely different to what it does today, right? And that forced an evolution in how these things work and how they engage users. And so the technology is moving, they grow very fast. But the other problem is scientifically understanding it. When an airplane goes down, it's black and white. The plane went down, or it didn't start, or some other failure, right? Like, it didn't work as expected. It's really black and white. And so we can take that incident and say, there is definitely a problem here, so we need to look for the source of the problem. Whereas when it comes to these social applications, they're actually very difficult to study, and people may not realize why they're so difficult to study. And I've come to believe it's because of the network effects of these sites. So we can study an individual. We can pull you out, Greg, and if you join a study, we can say, we'd like to take you off social media for 30 days, or we'd like to leave you on it, but we're going to eliminate the use of the like button or some other feature, right? And we can study your mood and the influence that has. But the problem is, we're studying you as an individual, and these are social applications, which means all your friends and colleagues are still using those applications. So while you may experience some mental health benefits from being off it, you're probably also experiencing some downsides from the fact that you are now isolated from your community and you're not able to communicate with people, right? So studying individuals has proven not really to show the indications we want. So if you're going to study social effect, it's much more complicated and expensive. You would have to remove an entire community from that technology, like an entire university or an entire school, and you have to do it over long periods of time. That's really expensive. And so far, to our knowledge, and we did a lot of digging on this as we wrote this chapter, but that just hasn't been solved. So you don't have the same mechanism that regulators can bring in to say, there's a crash. Where's the crash? You're like, where is it? That's hard, first of all. But then, like, actually getting to the source of the issue is also really challenging. So this is a thorny problem, but obviously one that deserves attention.
Yeah, I mean, there are some relatively clear-cut issues. I think that all the things that are attributed to social media, we have sort of like the perversion of elections, we have the, misinformation, we have social polarization, we have teen mental health issues, addiction issues, privacy issues, monopoly issues. To sort through all of those things, the science takes time. And, for instance, let's take social polarization. The echo chamber hypothesis seems perfectly reasonable, right? If people associate with people like them and not with people not like them, and they speak ill of other groups, you can imagine echo chamber effects and tribal effects. Very reasonable, but the science actually is not conclusive yet, but it's actually leaning more towards a different hypothesis, which is probably what's going on is the megaphone effect, which is that the hateful, isolated views that we wouldn't have heard about on average, now everybody's a broadcasting company, we hear about more. So it will take a while to work through these complex issues. I think there's some relatively clear ones like preteen mental health, especially girls for some reason. I think that's relatively clear cut. In terms of social polarization, where we're still doing the science, and by the time we've got it figured out, we will be or already are well into the next wave of problems with AI and other technologies. So I think there's a new discipline that has a few adherents but needs to develop further, which is regulatory science, regulatory innovation. I think you can only fight these rapid digital and social effects with new technology and new regulatory philosophies. So that's an exciting area that I personally want to study some more.
Well, last question. Look, when we do history, we do it looking backwards. And so I'm wondering if there are any insights that we can apply to doing history, going forward, right? So, when you read history, like you always start with some seemingly minor event, there's a gunshot in, Belgrade or in, Bosnia or something. And all of a sudden, you got this war and so forth, right? As an investor or an entrepreneur or a strategist, a consultant, we're always trying to figure out, right, when something monumental has happened and what the downstream consequences are going to be. Can we learn anything from this story about recognizing these seminal moments and these things which can create profound ripple effects?
Yeah, I think there are a number of big lessons. I think one of them is to be modest about the precision of our forecasts in relation to technology. I mean, right now, the champions of AI all have very clear-cut views on the killer applications. I think history would say that it would be remarkable if their predictions proved to be correct, and so that we might need more optionality than that. I think there are things that we can do to embrace the serendipitous model, practical things we can do to embrace the serendipitous model of innovation that we've talked about. I think a question I like to discuss with CEOs is what's your referee game? Because if you're just a champion of your technology and you've not thought about how the trustworthiness or the safety of your technology is vouched for, then mistrust could undermine the diffusion of your technology. So I think this regulatory game is something companies should be inviting scrutiny in ways that are good for the industry and good for society. And I'm not sure that that's happening with AI at this stage. But probably the most striking one for me is, so we looked very hard for people that foresaw the evolution of social media at an early stage. And we couldn't find a single technologist that foresaw the good and the bad and the arc of both of those things. But we did find one person. It was actually a novelist, Gary Steingart, who wrote this novel in 2000 called True Sad Love Story. And he more or less nailed the prediction of social media. So we spent some time with him asking, is how come you could figure it out and the technologists couldn't? Is it just a freak accident? Are you just, doing monkeys and typewriters and writing Shakespeare, or, is there some method in the madness? And what struck us was that he was asking a different question. So essentially, there are technological questions you can ask about social media. You can say, what's the vision? What does the technology do? What do we want the technology to do? Gary was clearly asking another question. He was essentially saying, look, the future is already to some extent observable in the present if you observe granularly enough. So there was enough going on in 2000 that you could say, there's a pocket of the possible pocket of the future here. And then he asked a different question. He said, not what is the functionality of the technology, but he more or less said, assuming the full functionality of the technology, what will the primates do with the technology? Using my knowledge of humanity, what will the humans do with the technology? And his answer was, they will play all of the human games of the technology. They will abuse, dissemble, misunderstand, use as intended, use to deceive, charm. They will deploy all of the human games of the technology. And if you think about it that way, you sort of see more of the possibilities, because it's not this sort of technocratic, functional, deductive paradigm. And I think there's no reason why companies can't imbibe some of that sort of novelist perspective. So that's what I say about the future. I think what we can't do is to say this is precisely how AI is going to pan out.
And I'm guessing if you went back to Gutenberg, Bob, and told him, hey, guess what? You're going to unleash the religious wars and all this other stuff, he would have been like, what?
Yeah, exactly. He was just like, well, I was just trying to make it easier to make books, man.
Yeah.
But I think the key lesson for me looking ahead is that after 20 years of seeing things play out, some of which I expected, some of which I didn't, I think of the following. I think that the best thing we can do is not rule anything out. This is advice for like investors and entrepreneurs. Don't rule anything out. Pay attention, like watch closely for what's working and not working, and make asymmetric bets. Like that's it. I mean, the best example of that taught me that really the core of those lessons is that in 2010, I had 2 engineers in my team as we were just getting the Quid started, who were obsessing over this new thing called cryptocurrencies. And they were talking about Bitcoin every day. I would come into the office and they were in early just so they could like trade this new thing called Bitcoin. And they were just obsessed over it. And they spent hours a day. At some point I had to say, guys, like, we got a job to do here, right? And I saw this signal, I saw this interest from them, and I analyzed the space and came to the conclusion that it wasn't going to go anywhere. Which, it was perfectly reasonable analysis to believe that. And because I believed it and put it in a cupboard, like in my brain, I was like, yeah, that's not going to go anywhere. Then I wasn't watching closely as this thing took off. And I think that's it. No one can know analytically, or at least very few people, let's say, can know analytically that some tech trend or is not going to take off, because as Martin said, it's a chaotic system. It's a truly chaotic system that's fast evolving. So instead, it's better just to watch and observe really closely, read the signals, read what's happening today, and where you can make asymmetric bets. You could have put $1,000 into Bitcoin on that day. It would now be worth tens of millions. So that's a nice asymmetric bet where it's like, I don't know if it's going to work, but it's only $1,000. Like, I'd limit my downside, but there's huge potential upside. I mean, a similar one is when I landed in the US in 2003, I bought a Mac laptop, and I recently calculated, instead of buying that laptop, what if I just bought Apple shares? And Apple was already a huge company, right? It's like the coolest, best tech company in the world. It was already valued. It was public. If I'd bought, instead of a laptop, Apple shares, those would now be worth $3 million. And anyone that could afford a laptop in 2003 could have bought Apple shares. That's $3 million. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential in these small asymmetric bets.
Well, Bob, Martin, thanks so much for joining me. Those are I'm going to lose a lot of sleep tonight thinking about all the other things that I could have done, right? But then, of course, I wouldn't be here talking to you guys. So thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. This book is really a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. It's called Like, the Button That Changed the World.
Thanks a lot, Greg.
Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.